I thought I was helping a stranger. Turns out, I was handing my life a new beginning. It was one of those winter afternoons that made the city feel smaller, the streets pressed in under a ceiling of low, heavy clouds. The rain didn't fall in sheets, but in a persistent mist that coated everything. Pavement slick and shining, shop windows clouded with condensation, umbrellas glistening with droplets. From behind the counter of the café where I worked part-time, I could see people rushing past the window, huddled under coats and scarves, trying to outrun the cold. Inside, the air smelled of espresso and cinnamon, the low hum of voices blending with the hiss of steaming milk. I was halfway through restocking the sugar jars when the bell over the door gave its familiar, soft ring. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Customers came and went all day, blending into the rhythm of coffee orders and clinking cups. But when I glanced up, my eyes caught on him, not because he was loud or flashy, but because he wasn't. He stepped inside quietly, almost cautiously, the way people do when they're hoping not to be noticed. His hoodie was soaked through, rainwater darkening the fabric, the sleeves clinging to his arms. His jeans were faded, the knees beginning to fray, and his sneakers squeaked faintly against the tile with each step. Then I noticed the glasses. The right lens was shattered into a delicate spiderweb of cracks, the frame bent just enough to tilt awkwardly on his face. The thin metal arm was barely holding together, the hinge hanging on by what looked like a makeshift twist of wire. He tilted his head back slightly, squinting up at the chalkboard menu as though trying to make sense of blurred letters through fractured glass. The expression on his face wasn't frustration so much as resignation, as if he'd grown used to seeing the world this way. People behind him began to shift impatiently. A man in a suit checked his watch. Someone sighed audibly. But the man in the hoodie didn't seem to hear them. He just kept scanning the board, slowly, methodically, as though hoping the right angle might suddenly bring the words into focus. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the quiet way he carried himself, or the stubborn patience in his stance. Or maybe it was because, in a room full of noise, he was the only stillness. Whatever it was, I found myself moving toward the register, the roll of clear tape from the counter in my hand. "Hey," I said gently, keeping my voice low enough that it wouldn't feel like I was drawing attention to him. His head turned toward me, and for a moment I saw his eyes without the barrier of the broken glass, dark, steady, and unexpectedly sharp. "Your glasses," I said, nodding toward them. "I can fix them. Just temporarily." He blinked, almost like I'd interrupted a thought. "They're fine," he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice. "They're not," I said, smiling a little to soften the words. 2 minutes, no charge." There was a pause, a hesitation I couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, he reached up and removed the glasses, placing them carefully on the counter between us. His fingers were cold when they brushed mine. I took them to the side, straightening the bent frame as gently as I could before smoothing a thin strip of tape across the cracked lens. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but at least it would hold for now. When I handed them back, he slid them on, adjusted them with a small nod, and for the first time, I saw him smile. "Better?" I asked. "Better," he said simply, and the word carried a warmth that lingered between us. He ordered a black coffee, paid in cash, and stepped aside to wait. He didn't pull out a phone or check a watch. Instead, he stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in long, slow streaks. He sipped his coffee in measured gulps, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the street, like he was thinking of a place far away. I found myself glancing at him more than once as I wiped down the counter and handed out drinks. There was something about the way he occupied space, quietly, unobtrusively, yet with a strange presence that made it hard to ignore. He didn't seem lost exactly, more like detached, as if the world was moving around him at a speed he no longer felt the need to match. When he finished his coffee, he walked back to the counter to throw away his cup, giving me a nod that felt more like gratitude than habit. "Thank you," he said, and again it sounded bigger than the words themselves. And then he left, stepping out into the drizzle without pulling up his hood. I watched him through the rain-streaked window as he blended into the slow-moving crowd, his figure shrinking until it was swallowed by the city. The rest of my shift passed as usual: orders, small talk, the occasional rush of customers. But that moment kept replaying in my mind. The cracked lens catching the light, the faint smile after I'd taped it, the steady look in his eyes when we'd spoken. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Just a stranger with broken glasses. But when I locked up the cafe and started my walk home, the image stayed with me. The rain had softened to a fine mist, the street lamps casting halos of gold on the wet pavement. My shoes made soft, muffled sounds against the sidewalk, and in between those sounds, I could almost hear his voice again, low, quiet, carrying some unspoken weight. At home, I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and sank onto the couch without turning on the light. The glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, painting the room in pale orange. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint patter of rain against the window, and thought about how some people pass through your life in moments so small they shouldn't mean anything. But sometimes they do. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the scene over and over: his damp hoodie, his cracked glasses, the small nod before he left. It all looped in my mind, like a film I couldn't stop watching. I didn't know his name. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. But for reasons I couldn't explain, I had a feeling this wasn't the end of it. And that strange, unshakable thought kept me wide awake long after the rain had stopped. Some faces fade in memory. His only got clearer. The rain had stopped by the next morning, but it felt like it had settled somewhere inside me, a quiet heaviness I couldn't shake. I opened the cafe like always. Lights on, machines humming, the smell of fresh beans filling the air. But the rhythm of the day felt different. Every time the bell above the door chimed, my head turned automatically, searching for a face I knew I wouldn't find. Still, I kept seeing him. Not in front of me, but in the corners of my mind, standing there in his damp hoodie, glasses bent and fractured, eyes sharp, yet strangely gentle. It was the way he had looked at me before handing them over, like he wasn't sure if he could trust me, but decided to anyway. That look lingered far longer than it should have. Days passed, but instead of fading, the memory seemed to grow sharper, as though my mind was quietly tracing over its edges to make sure I didn't lose it. I could remember the exact sound of his voice, the slight roughness when he spoke, the way he said, "better," like it was about more than just the glasses. I started noticing people differently. Every man with glasses became a possibility. On my way to work, I'd glance across the street, into shop windows, down side alleys. My eyes searched faces in the crowd without permission from my brain. Most times, the resemblance was fleeting. Wrong height, wrong walk, wrong eyes. But every time I caught myself looking, I realized I wasn't just searching for him. I was searching for that moment again, the feeling of doing something small that mattered to someone in a way I didn't expect. At night, the dreams started. They weren't dramatic or romantic. They felt more like stolen moments from another life. Sometimes we were sitting in the cafe, talking over coffee. Sometimes we were walking down an unfamiliar street, the city glowing around us. In one dream, I was taping his glasses again, but when I handed them back, he was already wearing a suit, perfectly pressed, his eyes exactly the same, but somehow knowing more than they should. I'd wake up with my heart beating faster than it should for a dream about a stranger. My co-workers noticed. "You've got a savior complex," Marcy said one slow afternoon as she leaned against the counter, sipping a caramel latte she'd made by accident for herself. "One good deed, and now you're attached. What's next? Following stray cats home?" I laughed it off, but I didn't tell her that it wasn't about feeling heroic. I hadn't done anything that extraordinary. A piece of tape, 2 minutes of my time, hardly the stuff of life-changing stories, and yet, something about him had settled into me like a quiet seed, one that didn't seem to care about reason or logic. There was a strange weight to it, an unexplainable connection that made no sense. I didn't know his name, his job, where he lived, or whether he even remembered me. But somehow I felt like I owed him more than tape, like I'd been part of a scene in a book, and the next chapter was out there waiting for me to turn the page. Even my walks home changed. The streets I'd traveled for years felt different, each corner a place he could appear. The sound of footsteps behind me would make me glance over my shoulder, half hoping, half afraid it might be him. I didn't understand why it mattered so much. One evening, as I locked up the cafe and stepped into the soft glow of the streetlights, I caught myself slowing down near the window of the bookstore across the street. There, behind the glass, a man was browsing the front display. He had glasses. He had dark hair. My chest tightened, but when he turned, the shape of his face was wrong. I let out a slow breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rational part of me kept saying it would be better to forget him. That people like that, quiet strangers who pass through your life once, aren't meant to be found again. But some other part of me, stubborn and persistent, kept whispering that maybe this wasn't over. And then, just when I was starting to think I'd imagined the whole thing, it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those days where the cafe was quiet enough for me to hear the rain tapping against the window again. I was standing behind the counter, organizing the display of pastries, when I glanced up at the muted TV mounted in the corner. It was playing a segment from the local news, something about an upcoming charity event, and the anchor was introducing one of the city's top business figures. And there he was, not in a damp hoodie, not with cracked glasses, but on the screen, his face clear, his posture confident, his voice steady as he spoke into a microphone. His hair was neater now, his suit perfectly tailored, but the eyes were exactly the same. For a second I thought I was imagining it, the way you sometimes think you see someone you know in a crowd. But no, it was him, the man whose glasses I'd taped, the stranger I couldn't forget. Only now, he wasn't a stranger. He was someone important, someone the whole city seemed to know, except me. I stood frozen, my hand still on the pastry tray, my mind racing. He was here, right in front of me, just not in the way I'd pictured, not in the cafe, not in the rain, but on a TV screen in a suit worth more than my rent. And as I stared at his face, one thought burned through all the noise in my head. If this was him, then everything I thought I knew about that day was about to change. He wasn't holding a coffee cup this time. He was holding the world. It was 3 days after I'd seen his face on the cafe's muted TV when it happened again. Only this time, I wasn't expecting it at all. I was standing in line at the grocery store, my basket full of the usual end-of-week staples: milk, bread, a bag of apples, and the cheapest pasta on the shelf. My mind was wandering, half listening to the soft pop song playing overhead, when my eyes drifted toward the magazine rack by the checkout. And there he was, front and center on the glossy cover of Luxury Business Monthly, framed by bold gold letters that spelled out, "Ethan Kross, the billionaire behind Global Horizons." I froze. The cashier's voice, the beep of the scanner, even the chatter from the people ahead of me, all of it faded. My attention locked on the photograph as though the rest of the world had been dimmed. His face was the same one I had seen through fractured glass. Only now, the cracks were gone, replaced by flawless, rimless lenses that seemed almost to sparkle under the studio lighting. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit dark and razor-sharp, his tie knotted with precision. He wasn't standing in the rain anymore. He wasn't a stranger in a cafe. He looked untouchable. I stepped out of line without even thinking, moving closer to the rack. The headline boasted about him as the visionary entrepreneur changing the global tech landscape. A smaller caption read, From nothing to an empire. The man who made the impossible happen. The photo captured him in a moment of still confidence, leaning against a glass desk with the skyline sprawling behind him. His hands were clasped loosely, his watch gleaming, subtle, but worth more than my yearly salary. I didn't even hear the cashier call. Next in line. My heart was beating strangely fast, the way it does when you've spotted someone you know in a place they don't belong. Except this wasn't just someone I knew. It was the man whose glasses I'd taped with a strip of clear café counter tape. For a few seconds, all I could think was, what in the world was he doing there that day? Because according to everything on that magazine cover, he didn't belong anywhere near my side of town. Ethan Cross, worth billions, CEO of Global Horizons, owner of multiple tech patents, and a name that apparently carried weight in boardrooms across the globe, was not the kind of man who would wander into a small corner cafe on a rainy afternoon in a hoodie and broken glasses. I bought the magazine, not because I normally cared about business features, but because I needed to see what it said about him. At home, I made a cup of tea and sat at my small kitchen table, flipping through the pages. The article painted a perfect picture. Orphaned at a young age, worked his way through college, started his first company with nothing but a laptop and an idea, grew it into a multinational tech empire. The words self-made were sprinkled throughout, paired with phrases like private lifestyle and carefully cultivated image. There was no mention of him ever spending time in my part of the city. No mention of rain-soaked afternoons or taped glasses. The photos were just as polished as the cover. Boardroom meetings, charity galas, exclusive interviews. In every one of them, his glasses were immaculate, as though they'd never been touched by damage. I stared at those photos, feeling a strange dissonance between the man in the hoodie and the man on the glossy pages. They were both him, yet they felt like two entirely different people. I wondered if he remembered me at all. Did that rainy day in the cafe mean anything to him? Or was I just another face in the endless blur of people he crossed paths with? The thought stung more than I expected. Later that night, I searched his name online. Page after page of news articles, interviews, and press releases flooded my screen. He had founded Global Horizons 12 years ago, specializing in software solutions that now powered everything from financial systems to government networks. His net worth estimates varied depending on the source, but all of them started with a B. There were photos of him with other CEOs, politicians, actors. He seemed equally at ease in every setting, his posture relaxed but purposeful, his gaze steady. I even found a video of him giving a speech at a tech summit, confident, articulate, a man fully in command of his world. And yet, I couldn't stop picturing him standing at my counter, awkwardly handing me his broken glasses. That memory didn't fit the image I saw everywhere else, and I couldn't decide if it made him more mysterious or just more confusing. The next day at work, I mentioned it to Marcy, sliding the magazine across the counter. "This is him," I said. She blinked at the cover, then back at me. "This is the glasses guy? You're telling me you fixed this man's glasses with tape?" "That's what I'm saying." She laughed in disbelief. "You should have gotten his number. Or at least charged him for the tape. Do you have any idea how rich he is?" I did now. And that was the problem. Because knowing he was rich, that rich, made the whole encounter feel like a puzzle I couldn't solve. Why had he been there? Why alone? Why with glasses so broken he could barely see? And most of all, why me? By the end of the week, the questions hadn't faded. If anything, they'd only sharpened, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I found myself glancing at the cafe door more often, listening for the sound of it opening. I didn't know what I'd say if he walked in, but I wanted to know if he remembered. And then, just as I was convincing myself I'd never see him again, it arrived. Not in the way I expected, not through a phone call, not through some chance encounter, but in a small, cream-colored envelope tucked neatly under my apartment door. No return address. My name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was an embossed card with gold lettering, inviting me to an exclusive gala hosted by Global Horizons. My hands trembled as I read the date and location. An event so far out of my world, I couldn't imagine how my name had made the list. I didn't need his number to find him anymore. He had found me. And whatever this meant, it was going to change everything. It had no name on the envelope, but mine was inside. It was early evening when I found it. I had just come home from another long shift at the café, my shoulders aching, the faint smell of coffee clinging stubbornly to my clothes. The hallway outside my apartment was quiet, the hum of the overhead light mixing with the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards under my feet. And there, lying neatly against my doorframe, was an envelope. Not the kind you get in the mail. This one was heavier, made of thick, textured paper the color of fresh cream. No return address. No postmark. My name, just my first name, was written in a deep gold ink across the center in elegant, looping handwriting. I looked up and down the hallway. Empty. No sign of anyone having been there. My neighbor's door was closed, the sound of a TV faint through the wall. Whoever had left this had done so quietly. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and locked it again before sliding my keys onto the counter. The envelope was cool under my fingertips, its surface smooth except for the raised lettering of my name. I hesitated before breaking the wax seal. Yes, there was an actual wax seal, stamped with a small crest I didn't recognize. Inside was a single card, thick and perfectly cut. The border was lined with gold foil, catching the light when I turned it in my hands. You are cordially invited to the Winter Charity Gala, hosted by Global Horizons. Date: Saturday, December 10th. Venue: the Grand Meridian Hotel. Main ballroom, dress code. Formal. That was it. No dear before my name, no signature at the bottom, no explanation for why I had been invited to one of the most exclusive events in the city. I set the card down on my kitchen table and stared at it, the black ink letters feeling heavier than they should. Global Horizons. Ethan Cross's company. My first instinct was disbelief. There had to be some mistake. People like me didn't get invited to charity galas at the Grand Meridian. That hotel was a palace for the elite. Gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, a valet just to open the door for you. The closest I had ever been to it was walking past on my way to the bus stop. But as much as my brain wanted to dismiss it, my heart whispered something else. It's from him. The idea sent a rush of heat to my face. Could it really be? Had he somehow remembered me? Maybe the glasses, the tape, that rainy day. Maybe it had meant something to him after all. I sat down, still holding the card, and tried to think rationally. It could just as easily have been some sort of promotional thing, a mistake in the mailing list, or even a prank. But none of those explanations made sense with the fact that it had been hand-delivered to my door. For the rest of the evening, I kept glancing at the envelope on the table, my thoughts circling back to that moment in the café. His voice, his eyes, the way he'd stood in the rain without pulling up his hood. The memory had never really left me. And now, here was this invitation. By the next morning, my indecision had shifted into curiosity. I couldn't not go. Whatever this was, mistake, miracle, or something else entirely, I needed to know. There was just one problem. I had nothing to wear. Formal attire wasn't exactly part of my life. My wardrobe was made up of work clothes, jeans, and sweaters that had been washed too many times. The fanciest thing I owned was a black dress I'd worn once to a cousin's wedding, and it was far from gala-worthy. That's when I called my best friend, Lila. She answered on the second ring. "You never call me this early unless something's wrong." "Something's not wrong," I said quickly. "But it's weird. Can I come over?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting cross-legged on her bed while she rummaged through her closet, my invitation lying on the comforter between us. "This is insane," she said, holding up a floor-length navy gown. "You realize the Grand Meridian is basically a castle, right? You can't just show up in anything." "I don't even know if I'm supposed to show up at all," I admitted. "What if it's a mistake?" "Then you'll have gotten dressed up for nothing," she said, shoving the gown into my hands, which is still better than not going and wondering forever. After an hour of trying on options, we settled on a deep emerald green dress with a subtle shimmer that caught the light when I moved. It fit me perfectly, miraculously, and had a modest neckline with a slightly open back. Elegant, but not flashy. On the night of the gala, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, my hair pinned up in soft waves, a touch of makeup highlighting features I rarely paid much attention to. The dress hugged my frame in a way that made me feel both exposed and powerful. But my reflection didn't just look beautiful. It looked nervous. My hands fidgeted with the small clutch Lila had insisted I take, my pulse quickening every time I pictured walking into that ballroom. When the cab pulled up outside the Grand Meridian, my breath caught. The hotel was even more dazzling up close, every window glowing with golden light, the entrance lined with velvet ropes, a line of luxury cars pulling up one after the other. The doorman, dressed in a crisp black uniform, opened the door with a polite nod. I stepped out, my heels clicking softly against the marble steps, and handed my invitation to the attendant at the eye. Doctor, he scanned it, then gave me a smile that was both warm and professional. "Welcome, miss. Please, enjoy the evening." The doors opened to reveal the ballroom, and my world tilted just slightly. Crystal chandeliers hung high above, their light scattering across the polished floor like diamonds. Tables draped in white linen lined the edges of the room, each one adorned with towering floral arrangements. Waiters in black and white moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation and the faint strains of live music from a string quartet in the corner. And there, across the room, surrounded by a small circle of well-dressed guests, was Ethan Cross. He wasn't wearing a hoodie this time. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored to perfection, his posture relaxed yet commanding. The glasses were flawless again, their frames catching the chandelier light. He laughed at something someone said, and for a moment I just watched him, this man who had seemed so ordinary on that rainy afternoon, now standing here as if he owned the world. My pulse thundered in my ears. He hadn't seen me yet, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. The distance between us felt impossible, and yet paper-thin, like one step could change everything. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. Whatever this night was about to bring, it had already started, and I had just walked straight into the center of it. Every eye in the room was on him, except mine. I saw the man with broken glasses. The moment I stepped fully into the ballroom, I felt as though I had crossed some invisible border into another world. The air was warmer here, perfumed with the faint, layered scent of expensive cologne and fresh-cut flowers. The sound was a low, steady hum. Conversations, polite laughter, the gentle clink of crystal glasses, woven together with the graceful strains of a live string quartet tucked into one corner of the room. Every polished surface gleamed under the golden wash of light from the chandeliers overhead, their crystal drops scattering tiny stars across the marble floor. And there, at the heart of it all, was Ethan Cross. Even among a room full of people dressed in their finest, he stood apart, not because of anything flashy or ostentatious, but because of the quiet certainty in the way he carried himself. His charcoal gray suit looked as though it had been tailored with him in mind, the lines clean and effortless. His posture was straight but not stiff, one hand resting lightly at his side, the other holding a champagne flute he didn't seem particularly interested in drinking from. A half-circle of people surrounded him, men in tuxedos, women in gowns that shimmered under the light. They leaned in slightly when he spoke, their smiles just a little too wide, their laughs a beat too quick. He wasn't loud or theatrical. In fact, he spoke in a low, steady voice that forced people to lean in to catch every word. The effect was magnetic. I knew what they saw. A billionaire, a visionary, a man whose influence could open or close doors with a single phone call. But what I saw was different. I saw him as he had been in the cafe, rainwater clinging to his hoodie, his jeans heavy and darkened from the storm outside, his glasses, bent and broken, resting crookedly on the bridge of his nose. The way he'd hesitated before handing them to me, the way his fingers had been so cold when they brushed against mine. The quiet gratitude in his voice when he'd said, "Better." For a moment, my mind refused to reconcile the two images. How could that man, the one who had seemed almost invisible, be the same as this one, who drew every gaze in the room without trying? And then, as though sensing my thoughts, his eyes found mine. It was a sharp, precise shift, like a spotlight swinging across a dark stage. One moment he was listening to someone speak. The next, his attention was locked entirely on me. I felt it before I fully understood it. That jolt in my chest, the sudden awareness that the distance between us was shrinking, even though neither of us had moved. Recognition flickered there. Not the casual acknowledgement of a stranger realizing they'd seen you somewhere before, but something deeper, sharper. He remembered. He murmured something to the people around him. Whatever it was, they nodded, and he stepped away from the group with the kind of unhurried grace that made people naturally part in his path. He didn't rush, didn't weave awkwardly through the crowd. People simply moved, as though some invisible force was clearing the way for him. With every step he took toward me, my heartbeat matched the rhythm of his approach. The crowd seemed to blur at the edges of my vision, the music fading into a soft, indistinct backdrop. My palms were damp against the fabric of my clutch, my throat dry despite the champagne flute a passing waiter had offered me earlier. When he finally stopped in front of me, the rest of the room might as well have vanished. His suit was even more immaculate up close, the fabric catching the light in a way that spoke of quality and care. The faint scent of something warm, cedar maybe, clung to him, subtle but grounding. His glasses were flawless now, their frames catching the chandelier light. "We meet again," he said, his voice carrying that same low warmth I remembered from the cafe. There was a hint of something else in it, too. Amusement, maybe, or quiet satisfaction. It took me a second too long to answer. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," I said, though the words felt strange considering whose event I was attending. "Likewise," he replied, his gaze steady on mine. It wasn't intimidating exactly, but it was impossible to look away from. In the corner of his mouth, the beginnings of a smile tugged at the edges, as if he found some private humor in our reunion. I had a dozen questions, waiting. Why he'd been in the cafe that day, what had happened to his glasses, why he'd sent me this invitation. But before I could decide which one to ask first, he tilted his head slightly, studying me as though I were the one under a microscope. "Why did you help me?" The question landed heavier than I expected, settling into the space between us like a weight neither of us could ignore. He didn't ask it casually, the way someone might when recounting an odd story. He asked it like the answer mattered, not just to him, but maybe to me, too. I hesitated. My mind flashed back to that rainy afternoon, the way he had squinted at the menu, the impatience of the people behind him, the frustration in the set of his jaw. I remembered how something in me had tugged forward, refusing to let me walk past him the way everyone else had. "Because you needed it," I said finally. My voice was softer than I intended, almost drowned out by the music. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes seemed to shift, like the faintest crack in a carefully built wall. Around us, the gala continued. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter swelled and dipped. The music wove itself through the air. But I felt as though we were in a separate pocket of the room, one where time stretched just a little longer between words. He glanced briefly over my shoulder, then back at me. "Most people wouldn't have stopped," he said. "Not in that neighborhood. Not in the rain." "I'm not most people," I said before I could stop myself. That earned me the smallest real smile I'd seen from him yet. Brief, genuine, there and gone in a heartbeat. We stood there for a moment longer, neither of us speaking. I felt the weight of unasked questions pressing against my tongue, but there was a sense, unspoken but clear, that this wasn't the moment for all of them. Before I could gather my thoughts into something more, he leaned in slightly, his voice just low enough for only me to hear. "Then maybe," he said, "you're exactly the kind of person I've been looking for." And just like that, the ground beneath me seemed to tilt, not from the chandeliers or the crowd, but from the certainty that whatever came next wasn't going to be simple. He didn't just break his glasses, he broke his own rules. For a moment after those words, "Maybe you're exactly the kind of person I've been looking for," I thought he might leave it there. He seemed like the type of man who could drop a statement like that into the air and let you stew in it for days. But instead, he shifted slightly, angling his body so that the other guests' curious glances slid right past us, as if we'd become invisible in the glittering crowd. "I don't usually explain myself at these things," he said, his voice pitched low enough that I had to lean in to hear. "But I think you deserve to know why I was there that day." The gala around us seemed to dim, the laughter and music softening into background noise. I found myself focusing only on him, the measured cadence of his words, the faint glint of light in his glasses, the way his gaze held mine like he was gauging every reaction. "That morning," he began, "I woke up in my penthouse with 3 meetings scheduled back to back, a dozen calls to return, and a stack of contracts waiting for my signature. I could have spent the day exactly like I spend most of them, behind glass, speaking to people who already know my name. But that's not always how I want to remember life." He paused, letting his eyes drift briefly over the ballroom before coming back to me. "Every few months I take a day to disappear. No driver, no assistant, no security, just me, dressed down enough that no one looks twice. I walk the city. Sometimes the nicer areas, sometimes not. I try to see it the way I did before all of this." He gestured loosely to the grandeur around us, the chandeliers, the watch at his wrist, the unspoken weight of his name. "That day, it was raining," he continued. "I'd been reading in a park when the sky opened up. I shoved the book into my bag, but my glasses—" He gave a faint, almost self-deprecating laugh. "They slipped off, hit the pavement. Frame bent, lens cracked. Useless. I pictured it instantly. The rain, the pavement, the glasses lying broken, him standing there, suddenly blurred from the world around him. I walked into the first place I could find, hoping to at least sit somewhere warm until the storm eased up. That place was your café. I remembered him at the counter, squinting at the menu. Remembered how everyone else had ignored him. People stared, he said simply. But they didn't act. They watched me fumble, probably wondered what I was doing there, but no one stepped forward. And then you did. The memory hit me in full force, the tape from the counter, the way I'd carefully lined it up across the crack in his lens, my fingertips brushing cold metal and colder skin. "It wasn't just the glasses," he said. "It was the way you didn't look at me like I was out of place. You looked at me like I was a person worth helping." The sincerity in his tone caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but he shook his head slightly, as if to stop me from breaking the moment. "I've never forgotten that," he said. "In my world, people are often nice to me because of what I can give them. That day, you didn't know who I was. You just acted." We stood there for a moment in the quiet between us. The warmth from his words settled into me, threading through the nervous energy I'd been carrying all evening. Then his expression shifted, softening in a way that felt almost private. "I'd like to thank you properly," he said. "Over coffee. My treat. Tomorrow morning, here at the Grand Meridian, lounge by the west window." It wasn't phrased as a question, but there was no pressure in his tone either, just an open invitation. I hesitated for only a moment, the part of me that lived on caution, whispering that this was moving too fast. But the other part, the part that had wondered for weeks who he really was, knew I wasn't going to say no. "I'll be there," I said. His smile deepened slightly, as though he'd expected nothing less. I didn't know then what meeting him for coffee would mean, or how it would draw me deeper into a world I'd only ever seen from the outside. All I knew was that tomorrow morning, I'd be stepping into his world on purpose. And once I did, there would be no way back to the quiet life I'd known before broken glasses and rainy afternoons. The table between us felt like two different worlds. His world was gold-edged porcelain and skyline views. Mine was chipped mugs and café chatter. Yet somehow, in that quiet lounge, those worlds leaned toward each other, curious, uncertain, and about to collide. The next morning, I arrived at the Grand Meridian's West Lounge far earlier than I'd planned. I told myself it was because I didn't know the exact route, but the truth was simpler. I was too restless to sit at home and wait. The Grand Meridian wasn't just a hotel, it was a monument to wealth. Its tall glass doors slid open silently as I approached, letting me step into a world that seemed to run on its own, slower, more deliberate clock. The lounge was tucked past the main lobby, shielded from the bustle by tall wooden partitions and heavy velvet curtains in a deep emerald green. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of a different kind of silence. The kind that came from soft conversations, the clink of spoons against porcelain, and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. The air smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and polished wood, layered with something warm and spicy. Cinnamon, maybe, or cardamom. Sunlight streamed through the west-facing floor-to-ceiling windows, softened by the haze of a cool winter morning. The skyline outside rose in shades of silver and slate, the streets below alive with movement that felt far away from this insulated calm. He was already there. Ethan sat in one of the lounge's corner seats, a low table in front of him and the city stretching out behind his shoulder. He wore a dark navy suit today, the jacket unbuttoned, a simple white shirt underneath with the cuffs neatly rolled back just enough to reveal the glint of a watch. An open book lay on the table beside a half-full coffee cup, his attention flicking from the page to the window until he noticed me approaching. When his eyes met mine, the faintest smile curved his mouth, subtle, but undeniably warm. He closed the book without a sound, slid it aside, and rose to greet me. "Right on time," he said, his voice even and calm, but with a thread of approval running through it. "You don't strike me as someone who'd care about punctuality," I said, trying for lightness even as my pulse beat too quickly. "I notice more than you think." He gestured for me to sit, and as I settled into the plush velvet chair across from him, I became acutely aware of the contrast between us. The table separating us might as well have been a border, his side marked by quiet elegance and practiced ease, mine by the small, careful movements of someone trying not to disturb what they don't yet belong to. A waiter in a crisp waistcoat appeared almost immediately, placing a menu in front of me. The paper felt thick under my fingers, the kind that made you pause before creasing it. I ordered a simple English breakfast tea. Ethan asked for another black coffee. When the drinks arrived, they came in gold-edged cups so perfectly polished they reflected the light like miniature mirrors. The handles were delicate, almost too fine for my fingers, and the saucers clicked softly against the marble tabletop when set down. I couldn't help but think of the mismatched mugs at the café, where we'd first met, the kind with fading logos and hairline cracks along the rims. "I've been thinking about last night," he said after a moment, stirring his coffee slowly. "What part?" I asked. "That you're not most people." His gaze was steady, unreadable, but I could feel him weighing my reaction. "I believe you meant it. And I believe you've proven it." I wasn't sure what to say to that, so I reached for my tea instead, letting the steam curl between us like a thin veil. He didn't fill the silence with small talk. Instead, he asked about my favorite books, And I found myself telling him stories I hadn't shared with anyone in years. How I used to sneak into the public library after school. How I'd once hidden under my blanket with a flashlight so my parents wouldn't catch me reading past midnight. He shared his own stories, though his had a wider lens. Reading in airports during long layovers, hunting for bookshops in unfamiliar cities, the rare joy of finding a signed copy by accident. From books, we moved to travel. He spoke of Morocco's crowded markets, their air thick with the scent of spices and leather, of Kyoto in the fall, the temple gardens blazing with red and gold leaves. I admitted I'd never left the country, and he didn't react with pity, just curiosity, asking where I'd go if I could. It struck me then how easy it was to forget, in moments like this, that he was a man who could buy almost anything. He listened like nothing else in the world mattered, leaning forward slightly when I spoke, his eyes fixed on mine. But there was always that subtle awareness in the back of my mind, that gulf between us. His world and mine might have touched for a moment over broken glasses, but they were still oceans apart. Eventually, he leaned back, the conversation settling into a quiet pause. He regarded me for a long moment, as though deciding whether to shift the tone. "You're probably wondering why I asked you here," he said finally. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't," I admitted. He set his cup down, gently, his fingertips resting against the handle for just a second longer than necessary. "I don't often meet people who act without calculation. In my world, kindness usually comes with a price tag, but you, when we met, you didn't know who I was, and you didn't care. You just acted. That's what people are supposed to do," I said softly. "You'd be surprised how rare it is," he replied, his expression shifting to something more measured. There was a moment of silence before he continued. "I'm starting something new. A project. I need people I can trust, people who see value where others don't. I think you might be one of them." I blinked, unsure whether to feel flattered or alarmed. "What kind of project?" "We'll talk about that in detail later," he said. "But it won't be easy, and it won't be the same life you have now. If you step into my world, you'll see things you can't unsee. You'll have opportunities most people never dream of, and responsibilities most people wouldn't want." His tone wasn't meant to intimidate, but it carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what he was offering. I sat there, my tea cooling in its cup, feeling the moment stretch between us. I had come here expecting answers about the past, why he'd been in that café, why his glasses had been broken, why he'd noticed me at all. Instead, I was staring at an open door into a future I couldn't quite picture, offered by a man who could buy the world but was asking for something he couldn't purchase. And as much as every instinct told me to be careful, I knew before I opened my mouth that I was going to say yes. It sounded too generous to be real. The kind of offer you'd expect in a dream, where every what-if you've ever imagined suddenly sits in front of you, wrapped in gold. But the way Ethan said it, steady, matter-of-fact, made it impossible to dismiss as fantasy. The moment after I said yes to hearing more, he didn't launch into a sales pitch or drown me in corporate jargon. He just watched me for a moment, as though measuring whether my decision had come from instinct or calculation. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table. "I want you to work with my philanthropic team," he said. The words were simple, but I felt them ripple outward, carrying weight I couldn't yet see the edges of. I must have hesitated, because his next words came quicker. "Not as an assistant. Not as someone fetching coffee and taking notes. I want you to be in the room when decisions are made. I want you to shape those decisions." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it felt absurd. Me, shaping decisions in the same room as millionaires and executives? I'd spent the last few years juggling part-time jobs and dodging overdue bill notices. I wasn't the kind of person who sat at a mahogany table and discussed the fate of entire programs or charities. "Why me?" I asked, finally giving voice to the question pulsing in my mind since the gala. His answer was immediate. "Because you see people, not just their surfaces, not the labels, not the image they project. You see them. I shook my head slightly, unsure how to respond. You could find someone with more experience. Someone with the right degree, the right everything. I have plenty of those, he said, his tone not unkind. But most of them can't walk past a person on the street without turning it into a statistic. You didn't see a man in a hoodie with broken glasses. You saw a person who needed help. And you acted. That's rare. That's valuable. The way he said valuable made me feel like it meant more than money. He went on to explain that his philanthropic division wasn't just about writing checks and taking photographs for annual reports. It was about building programs that worked, programs that actually changed lives rather than generating headlines. We have the resources, he said. What we need is vision and empathy. Two things you have without even trying. Part of me wanted to believe him. The other part was still wary. Offers like this didn't come without strings, and I'd spent enough of my life watching people get tangled in them. What's the catch? I asked. A smile ghosted across his face. The catch is that it won't be easy. You'll be expected to travel, to work long hours, to deal with people who don't want change because it threatens their comfort. You'll be under pressure, and you'll make mistakes. But if you can handle that, the rewards— He stopped, as if choosing his words. The rewards will be in knowing you've done something real. I sat back, my mind turning over the possibilities. I thought about my current life, the endless grind, the feeling of running in place. I thought about the café, the rain, the moment I'd handed him that piece of tape without knowing it would lead here. And I thought about what it would mean to step into his world, not as a spectator, but as a participant. I must have gone quiet, because he broke the silence with something softer. You saw me when I was invisible, he said. That's not something I forget. There was no performance in his tone, no sense that he was trying to charm me. It was simply a statement of fact, one that seemed to come from a place far beneath the surface of who he was in public. I realized then that this wasn't just about him giving me an opportunity. This was about trust, and maybe, in some strange way, about gratitude. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. He nodded. That's fine. We'll figure it out together. It was such a simple response, but it disarmed the last of my resistance. Could feel the decision forming even before I spoke the words. I agreed, my voice steadier than I felt. At that moment, I thought I was saying yes to a job, a role on some polished team doing good in the world. I didn't realize I was also saying yes to being tested, to walking into rooms where my presence would be questioned, to storms I couldn't yet imagine. But as I left the lounge that morning, the skyline still wrapped in fog, I carried one unshakable certainty. Whatever was ahead, my life would never return to what it had been before Ethan Cross and his broken glasses. Luxury wasn't the hardest thing to adjust to. Trust was. The private cars, the glass offices, the polished floors that reflected your every step, those were easy enough to get used to. What was harder was stepping into rooms where I had no history, no credentials, and knowing that Ethan had put his reputation on the line for me. The first day I walked into his headquarters, I felt like I'd stumbled onto the set of a movie where I didn't belong. The lobby ceiling seemed to stretch impossibly high, with light cascading down from a chandelier made of crystal that caught every movement in 1,000 glints. The walls were sleek stone, the floor a flawless marble that made each footstep echo. Behind the reception desk, the company's name, Cross Global, was etched in steel letters, bold and unyielding. A driver had picked me up that morning, the leather seats still warm from the garage. I'd watched the city blur past through tinted windows, the familiar streets replaced by districts I rarely visited, where the glass towers reached into the clouds. Inside, people moved with a kind of purpose I wasn't used to, quick, focused, as if every second was accounted for. Men and women in tailored suits passed me in the halls, their conversations clipped, their eyes often sliding over me without pause. Ethan met me on the 48th floor, where the view of the city looked almost unreal. Tiny cars moving along narrow lines, clouds drifting so close I felt like I could touch them. His office was both grand and minimalist. Dark wood desk, a single abstract painting in muted tones, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline. "Welcome to my other world," he said with a faint smile. Over the next few weeks, I began to see exactly what that meant. He didn't just run one company, he oversaw a network of them, each a piece in a sprawling empire. There were divisions focused on technology, real estate, global trade, and, of course, the philanthropic branch he'd invited me to join. At first, my tasks were simple: sitting in on meetings, taking notes, reviewing proposals. But even those felt daunting when the people across the table had resumes that read like award lists and carried themselves with the quiet confidence of those who had never doubted their own place in a room. Some of them were polite, but distant, curious perhaps about why I was there, but unwilling to ask directly. Others were more open, offering advice or small gestures of welcome. And then there were the ones whose smiles didn't reach their eyes, who measured me in silence, clearly waiting to see if I'd fail. Ethan didn't shield me from any of it. "People will make up their own stories about you," he said one afternoon as we walked the length of a glass corridor that overlooked the city. "Your job is to make sure your work tells the truth, louder than they can whisper." It was a lesson I held on to as he began trusting me with more. Soon I was sitting in on strategy discussions for new philanthropic initiatives, reading through proposals for multi-million-dollar projects, and offering feedback, not that anyone had asked for it at first. To my surprise, Ethan didn't just let me speak, he encouraged it. If I questioned whether a project actually served the community it claimed to help, he'd ask me to elaborate. If I pointed out a flaw in a proposal, he'd turn to the room and say, "She's right. Let's address that." That trust was more intimidating than the luxury, more disorienting than the money, because it meant I couldn't hide behind the excuse of being new or inexperienced. I had to live up to it. It also meant I began seeing sides of him I hadn't before. In the boardroom, he was decisive, unshakable. In one-on-one conversations, he could be unexpectedly candid, sharing stories of deals gone wrong, of lessons learned the hard way. Sometimes, late in the evening, when most of the staff had gone home, we'd talk about things far from business: books, films, the odd paths life takes to bring two people into the same orbit. But there was always a part of him I couldn't quite read, a distance he kept, like a door that stayed locked no matter how welcome you were in the rest of the house. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of this new life became almost familiar. I was traveling more, visiting project sites, meeting with local leaders, hearing firsthand about the challenges they faced. I was learning not just about his companies, but about the way money could be both a tool for change and a weapon for control. And I was learning about him, not just the man on magazine covers, but the one who read quietly on rainy mornings, who remembered the names of people others forgot, who kept his promises without making a show of it. I began to think I understood him, until one night I realized how wrong I was. It was a Thursday. I'd stayed late at the office, finalizing a report for one of our ongoing projects. His light was still on, so I thought I might stop by to ask a question before leaving. But when I knocked, there was no answer. I tried again. Still nothing. The next morning, his office remained dark. No one had seen him. His calendar was suddenly empty, his phone going straight to voicemail. No explanation, no message, just absence. For a man who lived in motion, his silence was deafening. Whispers began almost immediately. Speculation, rumors, theories that grew wilder with each passing day. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd walk back in with some perfectly reasonable explanation. But deep down, I knew this was the start of something I couldn't yet name, and that the world I'd stepped into was about to tilt on its axis. Silence from him felt louder than the gala applause. In a life where Ethan's presence could fill entire rooms and his voice could shift the direction of entire industries, his absence was deafening. It wasn't just that he was gone, it was the way the air seemed to change when he wasn't in it. The first morning without him felt ordinary enough. I'd seen his calendar. I knew he had off-site meetings. It wasn't unusual for him to start his day somewhere else, returning only in the afternoon, or not at all if negotiations ran long. But by the second day, the absence started to feel deliberate. His office remained dark. No light spilling under the heavy door. No soft hum of his computer running in the background. Olivia, his assistant, moved through the halls with her usual precision. But when I asked about him, she gave me a practiced, almost rehearsed answer. He's fine. It should have been reassuring. It wasn't. By the third day, the current beneath the surface had shifted. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. People lingered longer by the coffee machine, their voices low, eyes darting toward the executive wing. Projects that should have been in motion stalled, waiting for his approval. Ethan's absence didn't just create a gap, it created uncertainty. And uncertainty was dangerous in his world. The fourth day, the first rumor reached me. It was a whisper from one of the philanthropic team members, disguised as casual conversation over lunch. "I heard he left the country," she said lightly, as if she were talking about the weather. "Some private island. No signal." By the end of that same day, the media had it. It began as a single online post. Unconfirmed reports suggest that billionaire Ethan Cross hasn't been seen publicly in nearly a week. Within hours, it was everywhere. Business blogs, gossip sites, even the finance pages of national newspapers. The speculation varied wildly. Illness, legal trouble, secret negotiations, scandal. One headline screamed, "Where is Ethan Cross?" beneath a grainy photo of him leaving a building months ago. Another claimed to have sources saying he'd been spotted boarding a private jet. None of it felt real, but all of it added to the tension that had settled over the company. The fifth day, investors began calling. Their questions weren't hostile, not yet, but they were sharp. Was he still running operations? Would projects continue as planned? Could I speak on his behalf? No. Yes. I'm not sure. I hated how thin my answers sounded, even to me. And through it all, there was still work to be done. Meetings to attend. Proposals to review. Contracts to sign. Ethan had always been the anchor. Whether he was in the room or not, you felt the pull of his presence. Now, with that gone, everything felt like it was adrift. And somehow I'd been left at the helm. At first, I tried to keep my head down, to stick to my lane. But more and more, people were coming to me for decisions, looking to me for direction. It was terrifying, and in a way I didn't want to admit, exhilarating. By the end of the second week, I had slipped into a new rhythm. I learned which fires to put out immediately and which could burn low for a while. I learned how to project confidence even when my stomach was in knots. And I learned how heavy the weight of trust could be when you weren't sure you'd earned it. But the nights were the hardest. Every evening, after the last meeting, I'd return to my apartment and sit for a few minutes in the dark before turning on the lights. I'd check my phone obsessively, scrolling through my calls and messages, rereading old texts from him as if they might reveal some hidden meaning. Nothing. Not even a single line. And that was the thing about Ethan. He didn't just disappear. He was a man of follow-through, someone who closed loops, tied off threads, finished what he started. The silence wasn't just unlike him, it was unnatural. By the start of the third week, the whispers had turned into open questions. The board requested an update I couldn't give. The press started calling my office directly. Olivia stopped making eye contact in the halls, as though she knew more than she could say. Then came the rain. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of cold, persistent rain that painted the streets in slick reflections. My shoes squeaked against the lobby floor as I entered my apartment building, my hair damp despite the umbrella. I was thinking of nothing more than tea and silence when I saw it. An envelope, resting neatly against my door. It wasn't like the usual mail. The paper was thick, a warm ivory color, the kind you had to special order. My name was written across the front in bold, deliberate strokes of dark ink. I knew that handwriting. My heart gave a sharp, unsteady kick as I crouched down to pick it up. There was no stamp, no return address. This hadn't come through the postal system. It had been delivered by hand. For a long moment, I just stood there in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the building, the muffled sound of rain against the windows. Then I slid my thumb under the flap and unfolded the single sheet inside. 7 words. Meet me where we first met. No greeting, no signature, no date, no time. Just the instruction, written in the same heavy strokes, as if the pen had been pressed too hard against the paper. I read it again, and the air in the hallway seemed to shift. It could have been a trick. Someone else could have written it, imitating his hand. But I knew better. I'd seen Ethan write, seen the way his letters slanted, the way his capital M curled slightly higher than the rest of the word. This was him. Relief surged through me, swift and overwhelming. He was alive. But that relief tangled almost immediately with frustration, with questions that demanded answers. Why had he been gone so long? Why the secrecy? And why now, after weeks of silence, summon me like this? I locked the door behind me, setting the envelope on the kitchen counter. I made tea, but it went cold without me drinking it. The words on that paper pulled at me like a thread, unraveling all my careful restraint. I thought of that first day in the café, the rain, the cracked glasses, the moment that had somehow set all of this in motion. What did he want me to see there now? I told myself I'd wait until morning, that I'd plan, think it through, maybe even bring someone with me. But I knew I wouldn't. Whatever was waiting for me where we first met, I couldn't stay away. And as I stood at my window watching the rain slick the streets below, the envelope still on the counter behind me, I felt the quiet certainty that this meeting would not just answer my questions, it would change the course of everything that came after. He was back where I had first seen him, only this time, I knew who he was. The rain-streaked glass of the cafe window blurred the city outside just like before, but I wasn't the same person walking through that door, and neither was he. The bell above the cafe door gave its familiar soft chime as I stepped inside, the warm air wrapping around me with the scent of coffee and baked bread. My eyes went immediately to the corner table near the window, the one where I'd first seen him hunched over, squinting through those cracked lenses. But the man sitting there now was not the same. Ethan sat tall, shoulders back, wearing a charcoal suit that looked as if it had been cut precisely for him, the crisp white shirt beneath it uncreased despite the rain outside. His glasses, perfect, frameless and gleaming, caught the light as he looked up. For a second, I was caught between 2 images, the stranger in a damp hoodie with a strip of tape holding his glasses together, and the billionaire who could buy this cafe and half the block it sat on without blinking. When his gaze met mine, something in his expression softened. He stood as I approached, a faint smile touching his lips, and for a moment I forgot about all the questions I'd been saving up for this meeting. "You came," he said simply, as if there had ever been a chance I wouldn't. "I got your note," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. He nodded toward the counter, and moments later, the barista appeared with 2 coffees, my usual order, though I hadn't told anyone here I was coming. He remembered. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The clink of cups, the low hum of conversation around us, the faint patter of rain against the glass. It all seemed to fill the space between words. Then he said, "I owe you an explanation." I leaned forward slightly. That would be a good place to start. He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "I wasn't hiding. Not from you, anyway. I was closing a deal. One I've been working on for years. It's complicated, but if it works the way it should, it will change thousands of lives." I waited, not interrupting, sensing that he wasn't finished. This wasn't something I could do from here, he continued. It meant leaving suddenly. No contact. No updates. Too many moving parts. Too many eyes watching. If I'd told anyone, he shook his head, it could have fallen apart. I thought about the past weeks, the uncertainty at the office, the media chaos, the way I'd had to stand in for him without knowing when or if he was coming back. You could have told me, I said quietly. His eyes met mine, steady. I know. And if I'd trusted anyone with it, it would have been you. But this was bigger than trust. It was about protecting the deal itself. I couldn't risk it. I searched his face for any sign of evasion, but there was none. Only the faint lines of exhaustion that hadn't been there before, the kind you get from carrying something heavy for too long. What kind of deal? I asked. A merger, he said. Between my foundation and a network of community banks in regions that have been ignored for decades. It'll open credit access to people who've been locked out of the system their entire lives. Small businesses, families, students. Tens of thousands of them. I felt the weight of what he was saying, the scale of it. This wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting the rules for people who had never been given a chance to play the game. That's incredible, I said. He gave a small shrug, as if brushing off the praise. It's a start. But it's going to take more than just me to make it work. It's going to take people who understand what it's like to be on the outside looking in. And then his gaze sharpened, like a lens focusing. People like you, the words hung in the air between us, as heavy as they were unexpected. Me? You've already stepped into that world, he said. You've navigated it, learned it, questioned it. You've proven you can stand your ground in rooms where most people would fold. And you've done it without losing sight of what matters. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to protest, to list all the reasons I wasn't qualified. Another part, quieter but stronger, wanted to hear more. Ethan leaned back, studying me. I want you to be part of this. Not just as an observer, not just as someone learning. I want you in the core team making decisions. I thought of the sleepless nights, the pressure, the scrutiny that would come with that role. But I also thought of the first moment I'd met him, the simple act of taping his glasses, never imagining where it would lead. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into my fingers, and realized I was already leaning toward yes. But somewhere deep down, I also knew that saying yes wouldn't just pull me into a new project. It would pull me deeper into his world, with all its secrets and shadows. And as I met his steady gaze across the table, I understood something else. Whatever came next, there would be no going back. I fixed his glasses. He fixed my future. It's strange how something so small, a bit of tape across a broken frame, can turn into a doorway you didn't even know existed. That rainy afternoon had felt like nothing more than a passing kindness. Now, I understood it had been the start of everything. The first official day of my new role began before the sun had risen. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror, the morning light still weak, washing the room in pale blue. My reflection looked both familiar and new. Same eyes, same face. But there was something in my expression that hadn't been there before. Purpose. I arrived early at the headquarters of Ethan's new philanthropic network, a building that was worlds away from the glass and steel skyscrapers he usually worked in. This place had history. The exterior was built from old stone, worn smooth over decades, and the carved wooden doors opened into a lobby filled with the low hum of conversation and the warm scent of fresh coffee. The walls were lined with photographs, not of board members or corporate achievements, but of communities. Children holding books in freshly stocked school libraries, farmers standing proudly beside new equipment, families cutting ribbons at small businesses they'd finally been able to open. Every picture was a story. Every smile was a reason this place existed. This is where it happens, Ethan said as he stepped beside me, his voice low but certain. He wasn't dressed in the usual intimidating perfection of his corporate persona. Today he wore a dark sweater, sleeves pushed up, like he was here to work alongside everyone else. We walked through the main hall together. People greeted him not with the deference of employees to a CEO, but with genuine warmth. Some shook his hand. Others clapped him on the shoulder. He greeted each one by name, remembering details about their families, their projects, their challenges. I could see in moments like these why people followed him, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. My office wasn't large, but it was filled with light from tall windows that overlooked a small garden in the courtyard. There, on the desk, sat a small wooden frame. Inside it were the glasses, the very same ones I had taped together in that café. I reached out and picked them up, running my fingers over the faint ridge where the tape had once been. "Consider it a reminder," Ethan had said when he'd given them to me a few days earlier, "of where it started, and of the fact that the smallest actions can be the ones that change the most." I placed them back on the desk carefully, almost reverently. The weeks that followed were a blur of learning and adapting. I wasn't just observing anymore. I was part of the decision-making process. My calendar filled with strategy meetings, site visits, and late-night brainstorming sessions. I traveled to towns where the main streets had more boarded-up windows than open businesses, to schools where outdated textbooks were held together with tape, to neighborhoods where a single loan could mean the difference between closing up shop and hiring 2 more employees. In each place, I listened. I asked questions. I learned that the first step to changing anything was to truly hear the people who lived it every day. Ethan was there for some of those trips, but often he trusted me to go alone. "You see things I don't," he told me once when I asked why. "You listen differently. That's why you're here." I kept the glasses with me on my desk everywhere I went. People would ask about them, and I'd smile and say, "It's a long story." And it was. But it was also simple. It was about seeing someone and being seen in return. Months passed, and I watched the network grow roots. The merger Ethan had been working on finally took full effect, and the community banks we partnered with began to transform. Small business owners who had been denied funding for years were finally opening their doors. Parents were able to take out affordable loans to send their kids to college. For the first time, people who had been locked out of the financial system weren't just getting access, they were getting a chance. One day, I stood in a newly renovated bank branch in a rural town. The walls were painted a warm cream. Sunlight poured through freshly cleaned windows, and the smell of new wood lingered in the air. A group of local children had been invited to help cut the ribbon for the grand reopening. As they laughed and jostled for a turn with the oversized scissors, I caught sight of Ethan watching from a corner, a quiet smile on his face. "This is what vision looks like," he said softly, turning to me. "And you're part of it now." I thought about that word, vision, long after the event. When we'd first met, Ethan's vision had been literal, clouded by cracked glass, narrowed by the struggle to see through damage. Mine hadn't been much better. Short-sighted, focused only on making it to the next paycheck, the next shift, the next safe, small step. But now, I could see further. Not just the next step, but the next 100. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to take them. Our lives had become intertwined in ways I hadn't expected. From cafe tables to conference tables, from shared late-night coffee in quiet hotel lounges to heated debates over policy wording, we had built something together. Not just a program, but a partnership. The glasses on my desk became more than just a memento. They were a compass. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, whenever the scope of what we were trying to do seemed too vast, I would glance at them and remember, change didn't start big. It started with a moment, a choice, a single act of seeing someone when everyone else looked away. I didn't know where this path would lead in the years ahead. Maybe the work would get harder. Maybe there would be failures. But I knew, without question, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. And it all began with a man I almost didn't notice, sitting in a corner cafe with rain in his hair and broken glasses in his hands. Some moments seem small, until they change everything. That afternoon in the cafe, I thought I was fixing a pair of glasses. I didn't realize I was also adjusting the focus of my own life. Now, every time I look at those cracked frames, I'm reminded that the clearest visions often come from the blurriest beginnings. And as for the future, mine isn't something I'm waiting to see anymore. It's something I'm already shaping, one choice at a time. If this story touched your heart, remember, it only takes one small act to change someone's entire world. On this channel, we share real, emotional journeys that prove kindness and courage can rewrite any destiny. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story that could shift your perspective forever. I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments the moment when a simple gesture changed your life, because your experience might be the light someone else needs today. And if this story inspired you, give it a like and share it with friends, because stories of hope grow stronger every time we pass them on.